Welcome back to the Washington Outsider Report on the Coalition Radio. For those newly joining us, my name is Irina Zuckerman, and I'm the editor-in-chief of the Washington Outsider. With us today, we have a special guest. We have a war journalist and investigative reporter, Hollie McKay. She's also the author of several books, including one about Afghanistan. And we're here to discuss her recent article discussing the Taliban's self-enrichment scheme, its exploitation of the mining sector and gemstones in Afghanistan, and what that means for Taliban's role in the region. Thank you so much for joining us today. And before we delve into this issue, could you tell us a little bit about yourself, how you got involved in this area, and how do you manage with all these to vet these sources in such a sensitive and controversial area of journalism?
Yeah, well, I certainly never set out to be a journalist. I mean, I always loved to write since I was a small child, but I was very committed to ballet and to sort of creative pursuits growing up. I broke my ankle when I was 18, so that sort of put an end to the dreams that I had of sort of expanding in that world. And I ended up coming to the US to study, to finish my degree, and then sort of randomly got this internship. I was in New York at the time. It was 2006. So it was sort of the beginning of this digital era when everything was still very broadcast based or print magazines. And then was sort of an opportunity for me to work at Fox News in New York, but on the digital side. And that really intrigued me because it felt like sort of this new frontier. And I was very young, and then they ended up sponsoring me, and I lived in LA for a long time, and was very general assignment there in my early 20s. And then I started to travel a lot and was just very fascinated by all the things that we didn't know and countries that I never heard of and cultures and people. And there were all sorts of things that I felt that I should have learned growing up, the sorts of things we should have learned when we were in school that we just don't. So once I was exposed to that, I think it becomes this sort of obsession, and that was what it was for me. And I couldn't imagine doing anything else with my life except for that. And so I really just kind of dove in and gave it everything I had. So it's been a long road now, but it's certainly a fascinating one.
And so your recent work actually focuses a lot on issues regarding Taliban, Afghanistan, and that's been a territory that has challenged many analysts, reporters. There's been certainly a lot of concerns about the accuracy of reporting coming out. There's been a lot of it's almost a legendary, the amount of manipulation and distortions coming out of various groups in the region. How do you manage to navigate that world, and how do you manage to get accurate sources for your stories?
Yeah, well, I've spent a lot of time in Afghanistan over the years. During the war, one of the reasons I left my sort of long-standing job was to go back to live there, and that was in 2021. So we're still sort of in pandemic time, and that was the talk was the US was pulling out. And so I felt very strongly that I really needed to go back to Afghanistan and document this sort of closing chapter of history. So I left everything behind and went back there in the spring of 2021, thinking that I was going there to document, I guess, the withdrawal of the US, and then that first couple of months or so of the Afghan government sort of standing on its own 2 feet. Of course, when August came and the fall happened so abruptly, it was certainly not the story that I was expecting to cover. And everybody was leaving, and I felt very strongly that this was not the time to leave, that this was the time to stay. I had interactions with the Taliban through the fall, and then sort of I was in Bazaar, so I wasn't near Kabul, so I was very far away when it fell, and so I was very alone, and so I had to rely on the Taliban to kind of get me out. So once I'd had those interactions, I felt a lot more comfortable in my decision to stay in the country and to go back to my home in Kabul and continue to report really for as long as I could. So, um, I guess it was sort of a baptism by fire with this very new world. And suddenly the Taliban weren't sort of this distant, shadowy force in the mountains. They were my next door neighbors. They were in the streets every day. They were the people you dealt with at every ministry. So it wasn't this I think scary or overwhelming sensibility that I think that it got portrayed to be on social media, because that is part of the problem. When you aren't on the ground, you're sort of relying on often very hysterical voices or a tweet or something, and the message does get distorted a lot. So living there, you have to become very sort of comfortable with being uncomfortable and learning to situate this new environment. And I think just like any war zone I worked in, the Taliban, they were no longer this insurgency. They were a government, and they were very much in the beginning trying to put this very different foot forward, I suppose. So, it's my job as a writer and journalist to give them their side, their hearing, their understand, but to also go out and to do the work and to talk to the people and to see and try to put these puzzle pieces together as best that I can, with the information that you have. But there really is there's just no alternative to actually being there, because you see things and you understand things in a very different way than being 5,000 miles away and trying to kind of analyze from a distance.
Those of us who have been on the other side of the world during this entire time, the reports coming in focused actually less on the everyday functioning, day-to-day bureaucratic and normal kind of efforts by the Taliban to deal with their newfound power, and more on the reports of the evacuations and the United States and its political role. So let's put aside what the US should or shouldn't have done and what happened to everyone once they left the country. Let's focus on the Taliban and their role as functionaries, as bureaucratic, as officials who are trying to navigate these institutions, which have been out of their hands for the past 20 years. What exactly was that first step? How did they come into their own, and how did they manage while also dealing with the challenges from rival groups?
Yeah, so I think sort of the Taliban that we see now, almost 2 years after the fall, is sort of a quite different to the Taliban that was in that beginning. So in the beginning, it was very strange because suddenly they were completely open. Suddenly you could just sort of walk up to a ministry gate and knock on the door and talk to whoever. I remember knocking on doors at the suicide bombing schools and being like, okay, I want to come in and see what you're doing. And they sort of were like, okay, come in. That really wouldn't happen now. So the Taliban in the beginning thought that they could sort of project this voice that there was a new Taliban. It was Taliban 2.0. It wasn't the Taliban from the 90s anymore. And that they could sort of project that they were going to be this great force for peace in their country. Again, fast forward almost 2 years, and we're looking at a much more draconian Taliban, a Taliban that has stopped women from going to school and working, and really just not all that much different than they were in the 90s. A little less harsh, maybe, in their sort of punishments, and we haven't sort of seen examples of street hangings or any of those very barbaric punishments yet. But whether or not that's a matter of time, we can only kind of stand to see. But I think in the beginning, the Taliban thought that somehow, they were very much hankering for that international recognition, and thought that somehow in being a lot more open that they would achieve that. But really, it didn't take long for them to just start to kind of revert back. I would say a month or so into their rule, as they were sort of finding their feet, figuring out who went where, that sort of philosophy fell apart, and it became a much more difficult place to work in terms of permissions and trying to get somewhere. And it just became a lot a lot more difficult overall. But let's not forget that the Taliban, it did have its own government structure in place pretty much for most of the duration of the 20-year war, because they would run shadow governments in every province. So whilst the US backed government would have, its official sort of governor and director of different ministries in place, the Taliban always had their shadow government operating on the side, because they saw themselves as legitimate. So sort of the transition into power wasn't, maybe as mammoth as you would think, because they already sort of had something of a structure in place, and they were sort of taking that again from the shadows into being something official.
This is very interesting because a lot of that does not come across from the reporting. And in fact, reporting itself has been very limited in general. There hasn't been very much about day-to-day activity. There's been a major splash of stories during the weather, the climate-related crisis, the humanitarian disaster that befell Afghanistan, and how Taliban was or was not dealing with that, and of course the delivery of humanitarian aid. But this sort of larger political governance issues have not been well understood or covered. And what you're saying, the fact that they have had some level of experience, albeit not on that sort of national level, it's kind of sort of creates a different narrative almost, and a different understanding of what is happening, and just how well adjusted they are in terms of their role. And there's been also a lot of talk about ISIS-K or other splinter groups that have challenged the Taliban. And now it seems to me that despite these challenges, they don't seem to be as close to dismantlement and fall and panic as some reporters have made it out to be. How have they been managing, despite these humanitarian and security challenges, to retain their hold?
I certainly don't see the Taliban losing power anytime soon. I certainly don't see another country coming in, and I certainly don't see any sort of these rebel groups like ISIS, which very much do exist, having any sort of power over the Taliban necessarily. But what groups like ISIS-K do is they really wreak havoc, essentially, as an insurgency, essentially doing, I guess, what the Taliban really did to the previous US-backed government, and that sort of destroy the fabric of this idea of peace. The Taliban really deals with them by pretending they don't exist. So they won't even really acknowledge the presence, or when you ask about it, they will sort of say, oh, that doesn't really exist. They're just rebels. They're a nuisance group. And they very much try to squash the coverage when suicide bombings happen. And mind you, they happen very frequently. I believe a statistic I read this morning was more than 1,000 Afghans have died in these suicide blasts since the fall of 2021. And these things are happening weekly in different provinces, sometimes multiple times a week. And they're often very large scale. We don't hear about them in the press, partly because I think that the Western media has really moved on. The US kind of wants to forget Afghanistan and is focused on Ukraine and other places now. But also because the Taliban really does squash coverage. They will stop media from going in, they'll put a blockade on, they sort of try to pretend something didn't really happen, they won't acknowledge it. I know myself as a journalist, I have been detained several times by the Taliban, and one of those occasions was trying to cover a suicide bombing on the Hazara community last year when I was there. So they really do their best to pretend that these things don't happen. So that's sort of their way of dealing with it, because they don't want to destroy this mirage or this image that they're trying to put forward, that they're the great peacemakers and that finally the war is over and everything is great and back to normal, which unfortunately for Afghans just isn't the case, because there is still a lot of uncertainty and a lot of difficulty and a lot of safety concerns that happen, but not to the scale of what there was when there was a war. When there was a war, you had the Afghan government, you had the United States and her allies, you had ISIS-K then as well, plus the Taliban. So there was a lot more then, but certainly what is happening now is still very much a huge cause for concern. And so the Taliban really deals with that by pretending it doesn't exist. Again, on a humanitarian level, it's just very difficult for Afghans to kind of get by and get through. And I think that the Taliban, unfortunately, with a lot of its very draconian rules against what women can do, has prompted a lot of the international NGOs to pull out of the country. But however, there have been kind of like different amendments made. And I know a lot of the different NGOs that I've done work with in the past, they still have a footprint back in Afghanistan because, they've negotiated whatever it is to allow women to be able to work. We don't really hear about that side of it either. So it is very difficult, but life goes on, and that's the thing with Afghanistan is the life might become challenging and depressing, frustrating, but when you don't have a choice, you don't have a choice. And so Afghans, their only choice is to get on with it and do what they can to make ends meet and to put food on the table every day and to simply kind of get by. They don't have the luxury necessarily of wallowing in pity and begging for help. They have to do whatever they can in that moment to survive.
And you mentioned the Hazara community in the early days and weeks following the fall of the government and the coming of the Taliban to power. There's been reports about increased abuses, increased persecution. Since then, in the past 2 years, there's been almost no in-depth coverage of what is happening with the Hazara community, their integration, and how they're dealing with the Taliban. Can you shed a little light on what's going on aside from them being obviously neglected on the security side?
Yeah, it's very difficult for the Hazaras. They've really long been persecuted as the Shia minority in the country. And yeah, it's very unfortunate. I think whilst they are whilst the Taliban, certainly does treat them maybe a bit like a second-class citizen in some cases. I don't think it's yet to the extreme that it was in the 90s, where they were very heavily persecuted. I think in some ways the Taliban has tried to resurrect that a little bit, but that really, again, depends on sort of who you talk to. They certainly are very persecuted by ISIS in particular, who will attack their schools, their neighborhoods, their communities, and that is, horrific. So for them, they just see all these forces kind of as the one same thing, and they certainly are not looking at the Taliban to be any sort of protectors of them. Very much Hazaras realize that they have to fend for themselves and protect themselves, and it, being Shia, they often have to look to Iran's influence to do that. But in the other case, for the first time, you will see some Hazara Taliban, which I certainly don't think you saw a huge amount of in the 90s. But now, you will see Hazaras that have joined the Taliban, whether that is to try to be some form of protection force or whether that's just to sort of try to get some form of income. I'm not entirely sure, but there are ones who have crossed over.
Have they basically converted to more Sunni form of Islam in order to join, or are they accepted so long as they basically just follow whatever it is?
I think my understanding is that they're very much accepted for, I don't think there is that expectation to convert by any means, but they're expected to sort of play whatever security role they play. And that's typically in their communities. They'll be working in their communities or at a checkpoint or doing something kind of in those particular areas where there is a large concentration of Hazaras.
Is there a perception of them of being sort of traitors to their communities, as sometimes happens when, when someone from a minority community joins an authoritarian regime?
Necessarily think so. I think it's just viewed more as being something of their own protection force, and the Taliban is the ruling government now. So that's really the only avenue to kind of go. Yeah, I mean, to be kind of anything else would be considered to be some sort of militia, and I don't think the Hazaras are seeking that reputation by any means, but again, just doing whatever that they need to do to get by and to try to protect themselves and hopefully have some form of voice or influence within this very sort of draconian Sunni dominated government.
Meanwhile, the Taliban has been quite enterprising at making its own ends meet, if nothing else, by cutting deals with China on oil, by engaging with the Russians, and literally whoever has an interest, even Iran, has they've had some tensions with Iran over water, but on the other hand, they've also had a fair amount of economic activity and support in the past. And now you're writing about this exploitation of the mining sector. How has that fit in within the larger scope of economic activity, and how does it work really?
Right from the very beginning, the Taliban really realized that this mining sector was a huge money maker for them. And of course, when with the sanctions, the money frozen, and a lot of the international presence pulling out, and mind you, Afghanistan for the past 20 years before the fall, it really was reliant. I think it was almost 90% of their economy was somehow related to war. So whether that be through military, whether that be through NGOs in the country or different programs, that's the majority of how people were being employed and getting money. So of course that was ripped out basically overnight, and so the Taliban figured with the billions of dollars they thought that they were going to get that was quickly frozen, that they had to come up with something else, some other form of revenue. So the mining sector was very much a glaring one, and I think we sort of have looked at Afghanistan. Of course, it doesn't have oil. It doesn't have a lot of the riches that, maybe its neighbors have, but it certainly has a huge amount of minerals. The Mizainak mine, the copper mine, is an absolute trove of money that could be worth very much billions, if not trillions, if it was mined. And then in addition to that, you actually have coal. And we don't really think of Afghanistan as a coal producing country, but it has quite a bit of coal. And the coal is very sort of purified and very good quality. And it's also very close to the surface, which means it's very easy to excavate. So the Taliban was very quick to kind of tap into these things that we've sort of known have been there, but because of the very precarious security situation in the country over the years, it wasn't able to kind of really tap into. So the Taliban government in that sector was very quick to kind of turn to that and the different modalities to try to see that as a way to make money by cooperating with, in their ideal world, they would cooperate with, whoever, but given that there's only a limited amount of countries that will do business with Afghanistan, they've been very much too quick to work with the likes of Russia and China and Pakistan and some of their other neighbors to try to make as much money as possible out of that. And I think that they've been quite successful in that in the past 2 years. In, I guess, bringing in the right people. In a lot of cases, the people that were already working for the Ministry of Mines or whatever the relevant branch was, have gone back to their jobs. Once that sort of initial period of fear and uncertainty died down, people, again, they need to survive. So it's not that they're without the expertise. They very much are, and the Taliban has tapped into that.
So just what is the scale of the financial success, and where is all that money really going?
It's hard to know. I mean, you can only look at really the figures that Taliban might tell you, and that could range between, 50 million every few months up into sort of the billion range. It's very hard to know, but I would say sort of on a conservative guess that they are at least making several million a month from their mining endeavors. They still have contracts again with Pakistan. A lot of that coal ends up going into Pakistan, which then sells to China and other parts of Asia and the Middle East. They have certain deals with Iran as well over energy sharing, especially along that border. So I think that, even though they don't have a large scale of countries that are willing to do business, those that do are very much invested in, getting however quick buck that they can. And the Taliban is sort of going forth with that. And I think they really pushed for international recognition for a long time. But in the sort of ensuing months, they realized that's not happened. So they've really doubled down on those relationships they have with those existing countries.
What is the story with the supply chains of this mining? Who exactly is doing the mining? Who is present on the ground? And what happens in the process of from point A excavation to delivery of the final product to the customers?
So the Taliban, I mean, itself isn't mining itself. It relies on private companies that, again, that have long existed in the country to do sort of the heavy lifting work itself. But of course, the Taliban takes a cut of it. They have to authorize it. They have to sort of get the permissions and the validations and things like that. So you have a sort of a range of Afghan companies. Some of them may be partially owned by other countries, or some of them fully owned by Afghans. I believe there always has to be some sort of Afghan ownership within the countries. And they, depending on the sector, whether it's coal, they'll ship that again, they'll extract it, they have a process, and then they'll ship that to Pakistan typically. And that's where it sort of goes from there. In terms of their dealings with China, it's actually a little bit more complicated. They still have to use Pakistan as that middle ground, even though China and Afghanistan do share a small border. That's actually never been that's an uncrossable border. There's no roads, there's no trains, there's no sort of direct tie between those two countries. That's a project that we may see. I would not be surprised to see that develop over the next few years as to some sort of direct supply route, but it's a really mountainous area, so it is very difficult. And so far, there's just no direct way between Afghanistan and China. So you still have to go through other parts of the country in order for China to kind of leverage the coal or whatever other mineral supplies that they are getting from Afghanistan at the moment. So it does vary depending on what it is in terms of the supply, but generally you're looking at Uzbekistan or Pakistan as being sort of the arbiters to the other countries that it does business with.
So we are seeing a lot of the also Central Asian targeting despite the previous issues. How does that work in terms of sanctions and in terms of international export controls and things like that?
I mean, a sanction is sort of a piece of paper, and that doesn't necessarily hold up, I don't think. Afghanistan is not sanctioned the way that Iran is sanctioned or that Russia is sanctioned. So it's a little bit easier to kind of work around. And I think companies and British companies I know operating there have found their own sorts of works around in doing that. But I think that, I mean, the countries that are sort of doing business with Afghanistan are not necessarily countries that America, maybe with the exception of Pakistan, but not necessarily countries that America has worked closely with sort of in the past anyway. So they tend to be the more outlier countries, again, Iran, Russia, Uzbekistan, countries that America isn't necessarily closely tied to. So essentially has little control over how they spend their money or what they do. So there is a really broad scope there that I think the Taliban definitely uses to its advantage. And there's a limit on what the US can kind of enforce or say or do. I think countries are going to do what's best for them. And this, as we've seen with sanctions anywhere in the world, really, they're not all that effective.
So what happens with the proceeds after the money is made? Where do they go?
So again, if a private company is operating it, they're going to get a percentage. The Taliban government is going to get a percentage. And again, the Taliban government uses a huge amount of that to kind of keep its government running and to pay its people and to sort of do as any government needs to do. So again, it depends how many pieces are in the pie for that. But you're usually looking at sort of both the government and whatever private company is, and both of those tend to be making money out of whatever that arrangement is through minerals or through coal or through copper or other natural resources that they have.
To what extent does it come back to the economy of the country itself rather than the overhead?
Yeah, well, that's really hard to judge how much actually goes back. I do think that unlike the previous government, and I was very outspoken about this, I think one of the biggest reasons that Afghanistan really failed was that the level of corruption was mind-blowing, and this was under the US watch. And so suddenly you had this country that was a really poor country, And suddenly, with the war economy and all this sort of money being thrown at it, and money coming in, and programs and NGOs and all these things, it became an absolute cash cow for pretty much everyone on every level of government, from military commanders to those working in different branches. Everything operated on a system of corruption. And it was, to me, it was so disgusting. And it was something that I wrote about. If you go back to the cigar reports, the Inspector General of Afghanistan, something John Sopcliffe was writing about for a good decade before the fall, but the US really turned a blind eye to it. And to me, that was the biggest mistake. It wasn't that the Taliban were this particularly strong entity, it was that corruption had eroded every level of the government and military, to the point that it was weak. And the money that we as taxpayers were giving to Afghans was never going to Afghans. It was going to people's pockets. And so I think that, again, despite the trillions of dollars spent, very little of it went to people that really needed it, or to a country that needed it. And Afghanistan could have been, a country, maybe not on the par of the Arab countries, but it certainly could be much more than what it is. But that corruption, again, that was taken from the people. And so I think now, I certainly think corruption exists, but there isn't the money there, and there isn't the scale that it was. And that was really one of the tenets that the Taliban fought back about, in saying that, we aren't going to be corrupt. We see what's happening. This is, this is going against our principles, and we're going to stop it. And I certainly think corruption is an inevitable part of almost every government in the world, but I certainly think that we're not seeing the level of corruption that we saw under the previous government. So I would like to think that at least some of it is going back, but into Afghanistan. But I think that is, it's very hard to sort of determine, because the country is so poor at the moment, and it doesn't have that, the sort of the humanitarian input that it had a few years ago. So I do think that, regardless of kind of how much you can put back into it, it's enough to sort of survive on, but it's not really enough to thrive on.
So on the one hand, you have these official and quasi-official relationships with several countries that are willing or are neighboring and kind of have to deal with Afghanistan. On the other hand, there is this untapped amount of wealth that far exceeds what you're describing, because there is estimation that there may be as much as $1 trillion worth of gemstones in Afghanistan that has never been fully mined. To what extent is there a black market or illicit trade also thriving, aside from these official contracts and
Yeah. There's been a black market and all of that for a really long time. I mean, I've seen it myself, in different parts of the country, in Panjshir or Nuristan, where you just have people that their lives, they're regular citizens, and they've managed to acquire tools, and their lives are basically, and it's very dangerous. They'll go and they'll blast into these rocks to get as many of the precious gems out as possible. But they're not necessarily people making huge amounts of money. Again, it's enough to basically get by. And then that, of course, goes to a middleman, it goes to a market, and then it sells abroad. You've got UAE, you've got all these other big markets in the Middle East that will pay a lot for those things, and they've usually exchanged hands multiple times. The black market has existed for a really long time, and that's partly because the mining sector was never really developed under the war, and that was because mining companies from the US or other parts of the West basically considered it far too dangerous to go in there, and that was probably a good call, because I would dare say the Taliban would have sort of attacked the presence of any sort of foreign company on their soil. But the black market's there, black market's still there. And I think even at some point, if and when the Taliban establishes a much more sort of formal or much larger scale mining sector, the black market will still be there. It's very hard to govern. It's sort of how people have survived for decades and decades. And so I don't necessarily see that going away anytime soon. And right now, it is a big part of the mining sector, because again, whilst the Taliban is trying to develop these things without that huge amount of international support, it is very slow, and it's a very arduous process, because they know they can't do it themselves. They don't have the resources or the skills to necessarily do it themselves. So they are relying on foreign countries to come in, and even countries like China that do business with the Taliban, they're still very hesitant to step into that fray and are still very concerned with security, and so haven't really established a very formal presence in that respect in the country yet.
We've seen the Taliban's cooperation or at least friendly interaction with a number of other proxies and insurgent organizations and terrorist organizations in the region. We've seen them interact with Houthis, with Hamas. To what extent does this network able to facilitate each other's economic development?
I think the Taliban is very much a inward focused regime. I think that the Taliban is really its whole philosophy, and that's been the case since the war, is we're not interested what you do. We're not going to tell you what to do, what you have to do. We're only worried about ourselves. And that's sort of part of the reason why Taliban is not considered by the United States to be a terrorist organization, because unlike Al-Qaeda or ISIS or Hamas or these other groups that have these sort of global jihad ideals, where they're very much willing to cross borders and to bomb and to sort of wreak havoc, the Taliban's interest is very much focused on Afghanistan. Afghanistan only. We'll leave you alone, you leave us alone. And that's sort of their philosophy. So I don't necessarily know. Of course, while the Taliban has relations with different groups and different governments and some very precarious ones around the world, I don't think that their interest is in any way to influence any of these places or certainly tell them what to do. And their philosophy is essentially that to be left alone. So that is kind of how they operate. And whilst they want to have relations with different places and very much love to have relations with Western countries, I think that they goal is to, you come here, you don't tell us what to do, and everything is okay.
But are they able to kind of use these other organizations and regimes to establish economic lifelines for themselves, or are they still kind of just on the basis of very basic communication level with them?
I think that at this point, I mean, we may see those economic ties become much more rich as time goes on, perhaps as they become more desperate or kind of just given up on the idea of international recognition. But I think it's more that they're looking at diplomatic, strategic lines rather than economic. And the Taliban still has to be very careful in the sense of, with the pullout sort of that agreement, the Doha agreement, was sort of hinged on the fact that they wouldn't associate or wouldn't harbor terrorist organizations. Not to say they couldn't associate with them, but they could not have them kind of have that presence and have a safeguard on their land with the intention of attacking the US or the allies or the interests. So they have to be very careful in their dealings, I think, with these foreign groups, because that could potentially jeopardize and give, whoever the president of the United States may be at the time, sort of another reason to attack or to launch an attack. And so the Taliban still has to walk this very fine line. And as much as it does assert its independence and we're doing this and that, I still think there is that sort of level of intimidation from the United States and what they are capable of. And the Taliban certainly doesn't want to see any more infringement on their soil. So it's a delicate balance. I think for now, it's more establishing diplomatic ties, but again, at any point that can also change.
Well, the elephant in the room, of course, is Doha, Qatar itself, which has pushed for this deal with the Taliban to begin with, and which has essentially provided them with political support all along. Now that the Taliban is in power, now that they have this control over this mining sector, this economic sector, to what extent is Qatar profiting or benefiting from that in any way? Are they one of the players who are engaged in that sort of trade?
As far as I know, Doha is engaged with the Taliban on a diplomatic level to have a presence. Mind you, no country has actually formally recognized the Taliban. So even though China and Russia and these other places might still have a presence at their embassies in Kabul, none of them have actually come out and formally recognized the Taliban. All they've done is recognize the relations with the Taliban, but not formally recognize them as a government. And Doha is also in that category where it does have ties. Obviously, they're still doing different flights in and out. So there is that kind of relationship there. But I really think Doha doesn't need Afghan resources. I think Doha has plenty of its own money and plenty of its own other arrangements with other parts of the world that Afghanistan is essentially small change to them. So I think on any sort of large economic level, that's not something that I'm seeing.
Now, this mining sector could be potentially a huge boon to the entire region, or if not a boon, then play a significant role in shaping these events. So far, it seems relatively small scale trading going on compared to its potential. Do you see the Taliban eventually over time targeting Southeast Asia for as a market for this further mining development and kind of breaking through the stigma in that respect?
Yeah, I mean, again, it really depends. Taliban doesn't have the money and resources to do it itself. It requires these international partnerships. And I think so far there is still just that fear of the security situation. Again, these sort of weekly, daily ISIS attacks, the Taliban again trying to project this image of, we're safe, there's nothing wrong, it's great, come in. Countries and governments are still very hesitant. Nobody wants to invest in sort of setting up shop and putting a whole bunch of money into the country when the security situation just hasn't stabilized yet. And so I think that until groups like ISIS are sort of no longer attacking on a frequent basis, I think that there's still going to be hesitancy. And I think the Taliban still has a little bit of a way to go to prove its stability. Again, this, may take a year, it may take more than that. I think eventually, countries like China, and China has the contract from Mazinak, and Mazinak is just a trove of copper resources. And China has had this contract since, I believe, 2008. And even 2008, copper didn't have the value it does today. I mean, there wasn't the electric cars, there wasn't the smartphones, there wasn't all the things that we require that for. But now, of course, it's the sort of the engine of the world. And China is sitting on this contract, and I believe it was sort of a 30-year lease. So 2038, it will be up. But even so, and I know this is a big sort of source of frustration for the Taliban, is the fact that China still, despite having this contract for so long, still has not come in and set up shop. Its endeavors to do so, or to at least kind of come and scale the project during the war, were met with attacks and other things, and so that hasn't happened. And the Taliban is quite frustrated because not only do they stand to gain a certain amount of money, but the idea of that contract was that China would build roads and schools and bridges and other sort of infrastructure. But China so far has not sort of made good on that lease yet, and they sort of point to the precarious security situation there before they do that. So the Taliban is very much projecting the image of everything is cool, but I think governments are going to take a little bit more time before they buy into that.
I'm a little bit confused by the goals of ISIS-K and all these other potential irredentist movements, because they don't seem to be really engaging directly with the Taliban. They seem to be targeting various random targets, often civilian targets and embassies sometimes, but they're not really they don't seem to be really trying to take anything over institutionally. They're not moving in and trying to conquer territory the way Taliban did. So what's the story with all these terrorist groups? What are they actually trying to accomplish?
Yeah, I mean, I really believe it's to wreak havoc. It's to try to prove that the Taliban is incapable of safe governance, and trying to destroy that reputation. I think ISIS-K knows that it doesn't have the manpower or the wherewithal to necessarily control territory the way that it did almost 10 years ago in Iraq and Syria. But what it can do is send a message and wreak havoc and cause civilians to not trust their government, and to be that PR nightmare for the Taliban, and essentially really what the Taliban was for the US-backed government. And so ISIS doesn't have, I think a huge amount of strategy in its targets, but its strategy is purely based on this idea of sort of hitting the Taliban wherever you can. And unfortunately, that involves targeting civilians and mosques and other places to send that really horrific message.
On the other hand, we've also heard of internal splintering within Taliban itself. It's very much a tribal movement. There are portions of it that have splintered off in Pakistan and turned into different than the tribal issues internally. Where does it stand in terms of cohesiveness?
Yeah, it's a very fractured government. I think we say the Taliban, but it's certainly not a monolith. You've got Taliban that are very much loyal to Pakistan, or particularly the Kandaharis. You've also got the Haqqani network, which sort of has its own internal loyalties. And then you've got different factions that agree and disagree. You've got one supreme leader that we've never really seen, who, again, I don't even know how much he exists, but he is the overarching ruler that everyone has to kind of go by, but that doesn't mean that everyone under that umbrella agrees with him or his rule or what kind of is said. So there is a huge amount of infighting with the Taliban over power, over what is appropriate or not. Even when you talk to the Taliban on the issue of girls' education, you'll find the majority of Taliban say that they support girls' education, but yet there's this one very hardline faction, and that's driven also by the supreme leader, that has sort of been able to kabush that across most of the country. So it is a very fractious group. And again, I wouldn't be surprised a lot of the time if some of these attacks at least are driven by internal factions that are very disheartened, disoriented, and again, trying to send a message of the Taliban is incapable of full control of the country. So it certainly is something Taliban tries to squash, but it is very much evident that loyalties vary depending on sort of what faction or what tribe that you come from. It is a very tribal society.
So, given this factionalism, who exactly is making the economic decisions, and who exactly controls this mining sector? Are these factions fully in control? Is the supreme leader the one that has the most access to these mining economic decisions, or is it, have they all been able to consolidate on this one topic, or is there something else that we're seeing? Can there be a huge internal fight over access to resources, for instance?
Yeah, I mean, there's certainly infighting and different aspects of it. At the end of the day, it is a one man rule, and
Mhm.
whatever the supreme leader sort of says goes. Although you may have many other high ranking people beneath him, at the end of the day, he is. It's a sort of essentially a dictatorship. He's the one that decides what happens and what doesn't. And so, as much as other people can have influence and direct things, the final word does come from that one particular person who, again, we've never seen in public. I've never heard a speech. People will tell me, yes, they saw him at the mosque, and yes, he exists. But again, it's hard to even know who this person is and exactly where their loyalties lie, and are they reliant on the ISI in Pakistan, or are they, are they in Kandahar and hiding somewhere? And so it's very shadowy, and it's very hard to know where this rule is being handed down. But essentially, when that rule is handed down, that is what has to be obeyed by all parts of the Taliban.
So this is interesting. We have this faction that has this access to huge resources. It's facing all sorts of legitimacy problems, and it's ruled by an unknown individual who is a man of mystery and may or may not really even exist as such, or we don't even know how whether that is really a person who is fully in control, or whether he is actually a puppet of somebody of some other interest. So we there is a bit of this murky conundrum we are facing with Afghanistan, because the rule there on the one hand is very clear, but on the other hand is completely not.
Yeah, it's very bizarre. To have a leader that's never given a speech, you've never seen in public, you've never even heard a tape recording. So it is very hard to believe where his allegiances are. You will talk to some Afghans who say, it's essentially ISI in Pakistan. That's where he kind of gets the money and the word, and the direction is driven. And then you'll have other people that will, swear that it's a group of people as opposed to one person. It's just very, very hard to know until we actually see a person in the flesh and recognize who they are. It's sort of anybody's guess. So it's a very bizarre way to run a country, I suppose.
It's very also different from other similar organizations and factions, because they usually have very visible charismatic leaders, even if they also have some shadowy leaders who are not as visible in the background. They usually have some sort of a very top level spokesperson, some sort of a guiding authority that people sort of answer to and are visible. That's part of the way they maintain their authority by being these very charismatic and visible leaders who do come out. So I'm kind of curious, how does that, whoever that is, maintain that level of legitimacy and have things not fall apart even more than they do, simply by nature of no one knowing whether that person really exists and who is actually in charge? That's the part that kind of mystifies me the most. How does that work in terms of internal dynamics? Why does anyone believe in that individual if they don't even know who that is? Oh, well, not
Mm.
who it is, but whether that
Yeah.
person is,
I think in the case of Afghanistan, perhaps it is that invisibility that creates power for the
Mm.
supreme leader. It's a figure that people have heard of and recognize and sort of those adherents very much respect. But in their view, that would be scary to sort of see him in the flesh. And so I think that in a way that mystery is perhaps what creates a certain sense of subservience.
So we have kind of the Wizard of Oz kind of situation, where we have this invisible power person. Well, one more last question. I don't want to hold you too long. The reason we have seen in the past this kind of a coalition of entities trying to block conflict gemstones from entering larger markets. Clearly, right now, the trade with Afghanistan itself in general is not particularly encouraged, if not outright sanctioned. But to what extent do you see this sort of coalition kind of specifically singling out Afghanistan in the future, or do you see Afghanistan under the Taliban eventually integrating itself more into the international trade?
I think it's going to be the status quo for some time. I think that, I mean, the Taliban obviously wants full control over anything going in and out of their country. They want to be able to, put import fees on it to kind of make a buck out of it. But like much of that part of the world, it's almost impossible to control. I think the Taliban will certainly do what it can to put its stamp and to make sure that it's sort of the authority as opposed to these sort of ragtag groups. But at the same time, the Taliban is also careful not to completely destroy people's livelihoods, because once people can no longer put food on the table, that's when they turn against their own government. So it's a very delicate balance. But I do think, at least for some time, it will essentially be the status quo for quite a while, because the Taliban, I think, also recognizes that people can't really do official business directly with that regime. And so if it can make its money and still allow, from the black market, and still allow sort of people to get by, I think you'll see that blind eye continue to be turned.
Yeah, sort of kind of a don't ask, don't tell economic
Yeah.
policy. Well, thank you so much for shedding light on this angle that has really not received nearly enough public scrutiny, and for giving a very different take on the internal situation that I think leads to very practical questions and a lot less of kind of emotional outrage with very little result to show for it. Um, for those watching the program, this was, of course, the Washington Outsider Report on the Coalition Radio, and with us was Hollie McKay. She's the author of a recent book on Afghanistan, portraying the society and through words, and also in conjunction with photographs. And of course, we just heard about the issue of the Taliban's control over the mining sector and what direction that is heading. It's could potentially be a huge windfall. Depends on whether they're ever able to fully exploit it, and that could change things in many. Whoever controls that market, it may change things in many different ways. But so far, as we're seeing, this has been a bit of a kind of mixed result on their end. We'll be back, of course, next week, Tuesday night at 9 p.m. as always. Please tune in for our next speaker, and thank you for watching, and have a great night. Thank you, Hollie.
Thank you.